I'm very excited to tell you about our first speaker today. Our keynote speaker tonight is Dr. Darrel Ray, beloved founder and president of the board of directors of Recovering from Religion. A psychologist for over 30 years, Dr. Ray is the author of The God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture, and the book Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Learn more about Recovering from Religion and Dr. Ray in our exhibit hall. It's been a pleasure getting to know Darrel over the last couple of years. He's been a supporter of CORT right from the start, and his kindness and sense of humor were much appreciated when I had to postpone our live CORT in 2020. Dr. Ray's keynote session today will address the issue of why professional psychology ignores religious abuse. Welcome, Dr. Darrel Ray.
So thanks, Janice, for this conference. And I want to thank specifically and especially Dr. Winnell for creating the intellectual space for this important concept and work. So today, I want to explore this new territory we call religious trauma. And I want to challenge some notions of religious privilege that have allowed religiously induced trauma to be hidden, avoided, or denied for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and to discuss some issues that lead therapists to ignore or fail to treat religious trauma. I'm going to explore 4 areas. First is religious indoctrination and its effects on the brain. Second, the trauma that we see every day at Recovering from Religion. Third, how therapists perpetuate or can perpetuate trauma or fail to identify its roots. And fourth, a challenge to therapists. So the history of trauma goes back at least to the U.S. Civil War and is certainly a part of any war. Soldiers with trauma were said to have had soldier's heart in the Civil War, U.S. Civil War, of course. During and after World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II, it was called battle fatigue. And today we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder. When a soldier witnesses an IED go off and kill or wound his colleagues, no one doubts that such an experience can create the conditions for trauma. As a result, the military and the U.S. Veterans Administration has taken PTSD very seriously and devoted many resources to learning how to diagnose and treat it. This, along with other research, has led to well-documented and tested protocols for treating trauma in adults. The advent of technology and brain scans has led to direct observations in the brains of those who have suffered trauma. Changes can be observed in the amygdala or neural pathways to and from other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus or the insula. While behavioral changes have been noted since the Civil War, it's only been in the last 2 decades that the medical world can document a change in the brain when exposed to exceptional stress. This eventually led to exploration of stress in children, looking at children and children's brains from a developmental perspective. It's become clear that excessive forms of stress have direct and long-lasting, maybe even permanent effect on developing brains. This research has led to the development by the CDC of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test, a simple test that helps document potential childhood trauma and its impact in adulthood. Dr. Winnell actually referred to this test in her own talk yesterday. In children, research on trauma and adversity is commonly described as leading to hyperarousal of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, that results in changes in the brain development in children. So I'm going to give you the overall titles of each of the sections of my talk, and this section is called A Change in the Brain. So let's begin by simply examining trauma at its roots. And please forgive the oversimplifications. I realize neurology is far more complicated, but I think we can boil some things down to the essence and from there create a path forward. First, trauma is a change in the brain. It's physical. It's not nebulous. It's pretty specific. By that, I mean experience of traumatic events creates a neurological response that can be seen in both MRI scans and behavior. As research has shown, just because a person goes through a dangerous or difficult time does not automatically equate to trauma. There are mitigating circumstances, such as having a robust social network, financial resources for therapy, or a loving and supportive, close relationship, like having a good, strong, loving parent. However, without these protective, mitigating resources, the human brain can and will be affected by a wide range of stressors. It could be seeing fellow soldiers killed or wounded in battle, or experiencing your house collapse in a tornado or an earthquake. But a child surrounded by religious dangers like fear of hell, punishment for being gay, or gender nonconformity, may also experience trauma. To the child in a household that takes religion seriously, there is no escape. They're surrounded by danger, judgment, punishment, ritual, and restriction 24 hours a day. So the inquisitive, naturally developing child is in a prison of conformity and punishment that they cannot understand and they cannot resist. The double bind. Later, as an adult, that same person prays, gives 10% of their income, behaves according to strict ideas and behavior, listens to religious leaders' advice, and does everything possible, and yet they still suffer or find themselves falling short. They're told to pray more, give more, and listen better to their leaders, and that their failure must be their own fault. This can only lead to depression, despair, and likely trauma, as they make decisions based on the religion, not on their own goals and interests. So this is a double bind. I'm condemned from my very birth. I'm guilty. I'm worthless unless I repent and do more and more and more. When I do more and more and more, I still fall short. When nothing works, the inevitable answer is it must be my fault. For someone caught inside this world, it is difficult, if not impossible, to see how abusive and toxic the religious environment is. Yet the brain feels the effects of this double bind. At an unconscious level, the mind knows there is no escape, and the brain retreats into depression or worse. This is a classic psychological torture technique, very similar to what China, Russia, and North Korea, have used since the 1950s. A psychiatrist named William Sargent first wrote about this approach to psychological coercion in his book, Battle for the Mind, 1957. The subtitle is, and you'll find this interesting, How Evangelicals, Psychiatrists, Politicians, and Medicine Men Can Change Your Beliefs and Behavior. While he didn't call the effect trauma, it has all the markings of trauma for its victims. As he describes in this book, trauma, he describes in detail, the same techniques were used by John and Charles Wesley in the early days of the Methodist movement in England. And many, if not most religions, use these techniques to differing degrees today. Whether a POW in Korea, a POW in Vietnam, a Chinese citizen in re-education center during the Cultural Revolution, a child raised in Islamic Somalia, a Methodist convert during John Wesley's revival campaign, a Scientology member going through regular audits, or a child or teenager going to church camp, the techniques of indoctrination are the same, and the symptoms of trauma are remarkably similar. Involvement in high control religions has a strong probability for creating trauma because it creates social isolation, restricted information, physical and psychological abuse, and constantly singing or saying, you are worthless, your natural desires and your body are evil, and many, many other things. You may also be told that you may be left behind. or have the constant threat of hell over your head every waking moment. If there were a secular version of this kind of control and treatment, no one would excuse it or give it a pass. If the principal of a school screamed every morning over the intercom, "You're all worthless," if the teachers threatened their children with punishment or social isolation, if a teacher regularly whipped and spanked or forced a child to stand for hours, if the teachers or principal forced students to perform demeaning acts as punishment, no one would endorse or excuse it. No one would think this is normal or acceptable. Yet millions of children endure this kind of life every day in the name of their religion. Much that I just described is not just standard procedure among Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or Muslims in North America. It is true of many religious groups that are not generally considered high control cults. I think we focus far too much on high control groups, when religious abuse and trauma is far greater in number among Southern Baptists, Pentecostals, and Catholics than there are even numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses. The Baptist and evangelical churches are far larger, but because they appear to be mainstream, they're not seen as high control. This is far from the case, as I will discuss later. A force for good. To an outside observer, the Catholic Church is an abusive organization on so many levels. Yet, no matter how much money they pay their victims, no matter how many devastating reports are produced, the church is widely seen as benign, harmless. The idea that religions are benign or a force for good pervades our culture, and that myth protects the Catholic and Baptist churches alike. As I write in my book, The God Virus, religions seek to take over the culture and political systems in which they reside. Much like a parasite that's able to hide from the immune system. Once a religion takes over a culture, it becomes immune to the systems designed to protect the people from its abuses. That is why, for example, church-based child care facilities are exempt from normal legal requirements in many states in the U.S. It's why clergy have often been excused from being mandatory reporters for child abuse. It's why religions are not held to the same financial standards that other nonprofits are. Religion currently dominates our culture to such a degree that it blinds people to the abuse it perpetuates. The result is a free pass to religions of all kinds. The myth that religion is a force for good conveniently distracts therapists and the culture at large from seeing the roots of abuse in the religious system itself. Indeed, we hear, it's not the religion. It's just a few bad apples, a bad priest, a bad minister, a bad elder, rather than the fundamentally abusive nature of the ideology itself. As we've seen with so many churches and religious institutions, religions not only create the bad apples, but also protect them tenaciously. The Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptist churches, among many others, have spent hundreds of millions of dollars protecting so-called bad apples. In the United States, in Australia, in Ireland, in England, in Italy, and so many more countries. They always focus on the bad apple theory rather than the roots of the abuse in the ideology itself. As therapists, we cannot participate in the bad apple illusion. Religious ideology at its core is abusive and meant to control and shape people in ways that violate basic human development. Whether purity culture, anti-masturbation, body as enemy, condemnation of LGBTQ community, terrorizing of children with fear of hell, women as second-class citizens, white Christian supremacy, or a number of other doctrines. We cannot ignore the systemic abuse and control that all patriarchal religions have, and many that may not be classified as patriarchal. The exceptions actually prove the rule. The number of religions that do not participate in these abuses are very few. Unitarians, a few Quaker meetings, maybe a Methodist or Presbyterian congregation here and there, and a smattering of others. It is so small as to be irrelevant. And those are largely dying anyway. Their numbers are a fraction of a fraction. I and my colleagues at Recover from Religion have probably seen more people with religiously related trauma than anyone on the planet. While we cannot and do not diagnose anyone, the behaviors and symptoms are clearly evident in the phone calls and the chats that we take. As a result, we are daily referring to people to the Secular Therapy Project for treatment. Why the Secular Therapy Project, you may ask? We cannot count the number of clients that chat with us at Recovering from Religion who tell us their therapist pushed religious and spiritual ideas in therapy. Some therapists refuse to let go of the notion that there should be a spiritual component in therapy, with or without the client's permission. Hundreds of graduate schools teach that spirituality is an important part of the therapeutic process. I've never seen any evidence that spirituality can be measured or quantified. It cannot be described without resorting to supernatural ideas. It's a nebulous concept that has more to do with the therapist's own supernatural ideas than how neurological systems work or how trauma should be treated. Yes, there are all sorts of loosey-goosey definitions of spirituality, but they differ almost from person to person and certainly have no basis in empirical research. Of course, the therapist must try to join the client in the therapeutic relationship. Of course, the therapist must understand the client's worldview. This does not mean the therapist must validate the supernatural beliefs that are part of the root cause of discomfort. Therapists who themselves hold supernatural beliefs will have difficulty seeing how supernatural beliefs are the cause of the client's problems. A therapist who is Christian will have difficulty seeing how Christianity could be the cause of religious trauma. Certainly not their brand of Christianity. Any well-trained cognitive behavioral therapist will understand that magical thinking is a serious detriment to change and healing. What are supernatural beliefs if not magical thinking? How does a magical thinking therapist help someone whose own magical thinking has created deep emotional conflicts, even trauma? How does a Christian identified therapist avoid the deeply flawed ideology of Christianity when the most basic doctrines are based on abuse? For example, love me or I'll send you to hell. Put your invisible friend above anyone else. Your body is your enemy. It does not matter how much one distills the Christian message and doctrine. No matter how many liberal scriptures you cherry pick, the entire framework is based on an ideology that's psychologically abusive. What is the need for this in the life of a therapist? Where is it relevant to therapy? A thought experiment might help us understand the problem. Imagine a Muslim identified therapist. What ideological framework would they bring to therapy? Would Muslim or even liberal Muslim beliefs be helpful in therapy? I'm sure the therapist thinks their ideology is an important part of their therapeutic approach. Or take a Catholic identified therapist. How would their Catholic ideology inform their therapy? Simple fact is, a magical worldview, no matter how liberal, is still based on magic. Hundreds of schools throughout North America are currently teaching graduate-level students that spirituality is important, that you must respect the magical thinking of the client, that you must be careful in challenging irrational ideas related to the supernatural. I have a good friend who started graduate training in marriage and family counseling at one of the largest, most prestigious religious affiliated schools in the country. He was still religious when he started, but since he's left all religion. He and I have had many conversations about his training and approach to therapy. He has an advanced degree, but it is clear that his training is woefully inadequate. The version of cognitive behavioral therapy he received would be unrecognizable to Albert Ellis, the founder of cognitive therapy and one of my mentors. His school's emphasis on spirituality was carefully taught so as not to disturb any of the doctrines of the church in which the university was affiliated. Let's take another example of another major university, Brigham Young University, the bastion of Mormonism, a school that requires students to sign statements saying they won't masturbate, they won't have sex outside of marriage, and vilifies the LGBTQ community. A grad student in psychology or counseling hasn't even gotten in the door before they've already created an ideological framework that's built to support magical thinking and avoid the possibility that their religious system is the cause of religious trauma. Or let's take it another step. The American Counseling Association, an organization with clear ethical guidelines about how counselors should treat the LGBTQ community. That same organization turns a blind eye to universities and counseling programs that refuse to hire LGBTQ-identified faculty and persecute students who do not conform to Christian sexual ideas. How is a gay student treated at Baylor University or Belmont, Liberty University, George Fox University? The list can go on and on and on. How are these universities allowed to train therapists even as they're violating the principles of good therapy? Here's a quote that I took from April 20th, that was put up on April 20th of this year, 2021, on the American Counseling Association's website. The ACA is built on a mission that promotes human dignity and diversity, respect, the attainment of a quality of life for all, empowerment, integrity, social justice, advocacy, equity, and inclusion. Any chance Brigham Young University might be violating some of those? I'm pretty sure they do. How do any of these universities and their counselor training programs gain the approval of the American Counseling Association? How will the graduates of these programs treat clients who present with symptoms of religious trauma? Religious trauma and mainstream religions. As I noted earlier, there's much focus on high control religions and their role in creating trauma. But let us not underestimate the power of more mainstream religions. At RFR, we hear two main concerns, including fear of separation and fear of death. These take the form of fear of losing family or relationships if they leave their religion, or if they're found out that they're gay, or whatever, and the fear of hell. Psychologically, we could classify these as number one, separation anxiety, and number two, death neurosis. Both are rooted in deep needs for connection and safety. First, let's look at separation anxiety. As a species, we developed in Africa. Our young were easy pickings for the predators. As a result, we have a finely tuned sense for connection to our tribe, where we are generally safe. But to be separated from our tribe in the savannas of Africa was basically a death sentence. You either get back to your tribe really fast, or you find another tribe that will accept you, which was highly unlikely. Fear of abandonment and separation from the tribe is deeply embedded in our species for good reason. Religions take advantage of this to control and keep people in the religious tribe. At RFR, we hear a common threat to our clients, from our clients rather, that my church will disfellowship me or shun me if I leave the religion, and that terrifies me. They often have seen how terrible other people are treated when they left, and they fear this for themselves if they leave, or if they're found out that they're gay, or if they're found out that they don't believe some doctrine in the church, or if they've had an abortion, or any number of things. This complaint does not come from our ex-Jehovah's Witness clients or ex-Mormons only. No, we hear this fear regularly from Catholics, from Baptists, from Nazarenes, from Scientologists, from Hindus, from Muslims, from Pentecostals, from evangelicals. The list could go on and on and on. And I probably missed some, and we've got some volunteers watching this talk right now. They could probably list another 10. In other words, the vast majority of religions common in North America, Europe, Africa, South America, and South Asia practice some form of social isolation for those who don't conform to their religious mandates. Now let's examine death neurosis. If your parents say, don't go into those bushes over there, the lions will eat you, and you've seen a lion eating a gazelle, chances are you'll take the advice very seriously. The child who listened back in the days of the savannah survived. The one who didn't has no descendants today, he got eaten. If those same parents would say, don't think about sex or you'll go to hell, the child's brain has no way to discern between the reality of lions and the terror of hell. They look and feel dangerous to the developing child and adolescent. Since most religions impose some kind of purity culture on children, their developing minds and exploring minds, developing bodies and exploring minds, will constantly hit up against things that can send them to hell. Just thinking about sex, looking at porn, masturbating, reading a prohibited book, looking at a secular website, all can send you to hell. If from birth you had heard every Sunday, every youth group, every church camp, you were told how dangerous lions are, and that they're everywhere, and your best friend just got eaten by a lion last year, take one wrong step and the lion will get you. How would your 5-year-old brain process this information? Now simply substitute Satan or devil, and you'll see how the brain of a child perceived the religious world they were born into. The main difference is lions are predictable. You can observe and learn their habits and avoid them. With Satan or other supernatural beings, there are no knowable, observable ways to encounter them, and they shapeshift according to the whims of the adult authority figure. There's a constant message that you're going to die and you're going to hell if you aren't perfect, if you're not repentant enough, if you're not submissive enough to your leaders or your husband, if you're not sexually pure enough. The constant blare of these messages leads to deeply embedded fears, which I liken to a ticking time bomb. A time bomb that is designed to go off when a person begins to grow into an adult. A time bomb that can lead to a debilitating fear of death, a terror of thinking for yourself and questioning the source of trauma. Let's talk about ideological control and therapy. Ideologies create systems of control. The fundamental principles of religious ideologies are the source of abuse and mental health problems in many. For example, the notion that you must forgive your abusers. It's a simple gaslighting technique that allows for further abuse and no accountability for the abuser and places the burden on the victim. It is not just high control religions that follow this belief. Baptists, Catholics, and so many others, so-called mainstream religions, all preach forgiveness of those who abuse. In recent years, with the popularization of the idea of religious trauma, we hear so much discussion of high control religions and cults. What we don't hear is the acknowledgement that most religions are ideologies hell-bent on control. More important, I don't hear therapists talking about how therapists are themselves captives of these ideologies. How does a Catholic therapist who participates in Catholic ideology actually do therapy with someone who's been betrayed by the church that hides and protects the abusing priests? How does a licensed but Christian-identified counselor treat someone who's been tormented by their Baptist parents to fear hell or the rapture or other ideas that are designed to instill fear and terror in children? In other words, if the therapist is captive of the ideology, is there a major roadblock to effective treatment within that therapist? Many therapists have been taught to tread very carefully around religion and may themselves be spiritual and feel there's value in supernatural ideas. There are currently a huge number of therapists in North America who adhere to supernatural ideas and are guided by their supernatural ideology. Major national conventions for counselors or therapists, too often the majority of workshops teach unscientifically based techniques. Techniques that are often based on nothing more than wishful thinking and supernatural ideas about the soul, spirit, or energy. Trauma experienced by a client is not supernatural, not a bruising of the soul, not an energy field that needs to be manipulated or a blockage of spiritual energy. It is also not a sinful nature or weakness to resist temptation. It is a neurological survival response of the limbic system. It is the client trying to negotiate a world that seems quite dangerous, full of sin, full of temptation, shame, fear, as well as perpetual focus on hell and damnation. This is all done at the cost of living in the here and now for that client. The vast majority of current religions are the source of far more harm than any demonstrable good. Most religious people harbor a huge reservoir of irrational ideas that undermine mental health, damage relationships, and healthy attachments. While not everyone experiences trauma as a result of their religious indoctrination, they do experience ongoing harms from believing in ideology that bears little resemblance to reality. Those irrational ideas lead to difficulties in life. For example, one of the things we see most commonly is perfectly loving parents disowning their own children from being gay or for leaving the faith. Those people are probably fairly normal and mainstream religionists, as far as I can tell, and yet they're engaging in a pretty heinous act to their own children. This is not a small thing we see. We see it hundreds of times, thousands of times every month. Now I want to talk about time bombs. I mentioned them a little bit earlier. During childhood, religions install ideas, beliefs, and behaviors in children that are designed to maintain control and religious adherence into adulthood. These ideas may appear to be innocuous, but they set the stage for a lifetime of control as the child matures. Here's one example among many I could cite. A woman raised in a moderately conservative home by loving but fairly strict parents shows no signs of trauma until she gets unexpectedly pregnant in her early 20s and decides to get an abortion. Throughout the process, she finds people judging her and condemning her for her choice. She also spontaneously starts hearing and remembering old biblical message and sermons about her evil nature and sexual sin. It is as if all her previous religious indoctrination had no serious bearing on her until her abortion decision. Then it seemed to bring all that old training and indoctrination into hot, searing focus directly on her. Months after her abortion, she shows symptoms of trauma, inability to sleep, extreme emotional responses, strong repulsion to the sex she used to enjoy with her boyfriend. This soon leads to an eating disorder and diagnosed depression. At the same time, her church and family reject her and her boyfriend becomes less supportive. Her entire support system collapses. So my question is, did this woman experience religious trauma when she was still young? Was it just hidden? Or was it the ticking time bomb going off? To understand this, we can ask, would she experience this trauma if she had been raised without religion and these ideas were never implanted in her brain? She did not appear to experience any religious trauma until her old and deep religious training appeared at her doorstep and brought the full weight of her ideology down on her in young adulthood. To add to this trauma, the time bomb was magnified by the rejection and loss of social support. I could give you many ideas of men and women who did not appear to experience trauma in their childhood, but experienced immense guilt and shame leading to trauma in a manner similar to this woman. Many clients have told me they had a good childhood and they enjoyed the church until the time bomb went off and made their life miserable as young adults. let me suggest that the story we heard just last night from Alice Gretchen is remarkably similar, with almost all the same elements that I have mentioned already. And I basically wrote this talk weeks ago. So thanks to Gretchen for her story and great presentation last night. I'm sorry, Alice. I keep getting your name mixed up. Alice Gretchen. So let's talk about the supernatural in therapy. How would a therapist with supernatural beliefs help this woman that I just mentioned earlier? Is it possible that a therapist who is religious may unconsciously avoid helping the client deal with supernatural ideas that are the cause of their excruciating internal conflict and emotional turmoil? In my career, I've heard many therapists claim they can help people without their own religious ideas influencing them. I am not convinced. The hard fact is, to believe something like Catholic ideology is to have beliefs about the value of virginity, the dangers of masturbation, sinfulness of non-marital sex, and so much more. These ideas are the cause of much guilt, shame, and trauma. These are not benign beliefs. They are not harmless, nor can they be ignored in therapy. A therapist who has not examined the deeply irrational ideas embedded in their particular religious ideology is in a poor position to help a client address religious trauma. About 5 years ago, I had an interesting exchange with a PhD psychologist who wanted to apply to the Secular Therapy Project. As you know, we vet our candidates very carefully. His application revealed that he was Catholic and graduated from Notre Dame, pretty darn good school. He claimed he was well-trained and would have no problem keeping his religion out of his practice. So I answered, with a simple question. I said, an 18-year-old pregnant college student comes to you for depression. In the course of the first few interviews, she reveals that she has an appointment for an abortion the next day. She asks for some advice on how to relax and deal with the loud, screaming protesters she anticipates will harass her. After sending the psychologist several emails to try to get a response, he finally responded. His response was, I couldn't help her, and he withdrew his application. I've done the same thing with Baptist therapists and many others over the years. The only therapists I found who seemed capable of keeping their religion out of their practice were Unitarians, Quakers, and some super liberal religions. But of course, as we said earlier, they are a fraction of therapists. If we were to treat religious trauma, it seems reasonable to be able to acknowledge the source of the trauma and certainly address it directly without tiptoeing around. A religious therapist has potential to exacerbate religious trauma when they have not addressed their own supernatural beliefs. Now I want to talk about training therapists. Let's look at the reality on the ground. Today, thousands of master's and PhD level graduates are being produced by Liberty University, Brigham Young University, Regents University, Oral Roberts University, hundreds more of mental health professionals from these institutions. They require things from their students, requirements that are key principles of their religious ideology. Purity requirements, no masturbation, no sex outside of marriage, no pornography. How does a therapist graduate from such an institution with the skills and emotional intelligence to help somebody with issues of body shame or guilt around their sexual identity? How does a therapist who was themselves subjected to the trauma-inducing ideology help someone who was traumatized by the very ideology that the counselor holds? To any therapist who holds supernatural beliefs, my challenge to you is this. If Jesus and Allah and Joseph Smith and Mary and Saint whoever are not the answer to mental health problems, could they be the source of the problems? How do your supernatural beliefs add to your therapeutic skills? Could your irrational beliefs prevent you from helping others challenge their supernatural ideas? Finally, if you subscribe to the bad apple theory of religious abuse, you're missing the power of ideological systems to impact mental health, as well as brain and sexual development. You are asking people to drink fresh water even as they're swimming in a cesspool of religious pollution. Let's look at the most basic concept in religion, the notion of sin. Embedded in the concept of sin are the roots of all religious abuse. It is a conceptual framework for imprisoning the mind for a lifetime. It cannot be defined, measured, quantified, and is completely malleable in the hands of any religious leader for whatever manipulation serves their purpose. Our clients have come to us, our clients that recover from religion come to us oftentimes with a deep sense of sin, shame, guilt. To the degree that a therapist buys into the whole notion of sin, they're themselves part of the religious trap that it creates. I can hear the voices already of protest, but we must respect the religious and spiritual beliefs of our clients. I can respect the person sitting in front of me. I can help them challenge ideas without being respectful. But I see no reason to treat irrational religious ideas any different than any other irrational idea. I can be curious about their view and ideas of spirituality. I can help them explore the intersection of their mental health and religious understanding based on what they themselves express. For example, I might reflect, how does the religious idea that you are worthless impact you? We might explore that a bit. Within religious ideology are systemic issues the client will encounter, roadblocks to their mental health that come directly from the dogma. Forgive your abuser. You're worthless without your God. Your mental illness is your own fault. You're miserable because you're sin. Being trans is a sin against God. The list of abusive and downright damaging ideas is incredibly long. A therapist must have the skills and the willingness to help the client examine these beliefs. A gay client who harbors the self-hate of their religion is swimming upstream against their own religious ideology. Why do they stay? Because they need and want community of their church. The same is true of most religious people dealing with mental health issues. The messages of religion are often terrible mental health advice, but people still need community. We must help our clients examine their toxic beliefs, but we may also need to help them find alternative communities that will support their mental health rather than undermine it. The notion that religious ideas cannot be challenged in therapy is simply an extension of the religious privilege that allows religion to live unquestioned and unchallenged in our culture. There are many ways to respectfully work with a client, many ways to help them challenge ideas and dogmas and mitigate the trauma of religious abuse. The only limit is the training and creativity of the therapist. Start by discarding the notion that religion has some special, unassailable privilege in the therapeutic relationship. One way to understand this issue is a simple thought experiment. Imagine going to a therapist who's trauma trained, walking to their office and you see a few religious books, maybe a cross or a religious icon. A Christian patient might be comforted. If they're dealing with religious trauma, they might be triggered. Now, slightly change the scene. This time, and I'm talking about you who are listening to me right now, this time when you walk into the office, you see evidence of a trauma-trained therapist, and you see a Quran and a few small indicators of Islamic faith. How might this impact you or a client? If they're Muslim, they might feel comforted. If Christian, they might feel uncomfortable. If they're dealing with religious trauma, they may be triggered. If the supernatural beliefs of the therapist are irrelevant to the therapy, then it shouldn't matter what religious symbols are in the room. But it does matter. If you would not be comfortable with a Muslim therapist, you might consider why you're uncomfortable. Is it because Muslim supernatural beliefs are not compatible with your Christian supernatural beliefs? Both are supernatural, and neither add anything to the skills of the therapist. If you wish to help clients who have experienced religious trauma, it's best to remove supernatural ideas from your practice and focus on the impact of religious ideology on your client. In closing, I think it's useful to recognize that religion is nothing more than an ideology cloaked in a supernatural protection racket. As therapists, we will be less effective if we buy into the protection racket.
Wow, doctor, that was amazing. You are on fire.
I am pissed
terrific.
off because
Yeah.
there's so many bad therapists and they're perpetuating the trauma that we're here to talk about. I can get really angry about this, but I tried to hold my temper tonight. Thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate the time.